Okay, hello, Jennifer and Gareth. Please introduce yourselves and give my audience a synopsis of your TV show, How to Buy a Country.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's really exciting. Um, it's less of a TV show than a web series because we're releasing it on YouTube on Canada Day, so you'll be able to see it then. But it's a docu-series called How to Buy a Country, which is the subtitle is Inside the Plan to Make Canada the 51st State, which is kind of provocative in nature. And there's a reason why it comes out on Canada Day, which is that we wanted to tell this broader history of U.S. influence in Canada, and how it has reshaped our economy and our society in ways that people might not necessarily be aware of, and to give a much larger historical context to a lot of the sort of feelings and anxieties that people have had in the last year, in response to the trade war and Donald Trump's 51st state threats and all those kinds of things. And so we really, in a way, the series, which it's very archival heavy and it's very much inspired by Adam Curtis, is kind of a walkthrough in a way of the political and economic history of the 20th century, and in particular the era that we now call globalization. So the period of like 1980 onwards, and in particular the role of free trade in sort of joining the United States and Canada much more intimately together, and the consequences that that's had, and then also investigates potential future pathways for the country. So yeah, that's a little synopsis there.
Lovely. All right. And why did you want to tell this story and make this educational web series as the executive director of Regeneration?
Yeah, so I started this organization. It's called Regeneration. It's a youth advocacy group that I founded in with a business partner in 2019, and then we turned it into a actual nonprofit organization in 2021. And from the beginning, even though it took different forms, the organization was always really focused on political education and consciousness raising, especially among young people. And the goal of that being to give people this broader critique of power systems and power structures than that we often found that they didn't have, particularly in a business school landscape. I came from business school, and we started the organization as a coalition of students across the country that were really trying to transform capitalism, and in particular the way that capitalism is reproduced through the structure of business schools. But over time, we've morphed into doing a lot more digital media and storytelling as a way of reaching young people. And this campaign is really a culmination of a lot of work that's gone into understanding really sort of the interconnection of three really big stories. One is the rise of U.S. influence in Canada, the transition of our society to the increasing control of corporations over our government, and then also the rise of Canada's structural dependence on the fossil fuel industry, and the costs that that's had, not just for our climate, but for workers and communities, etc. And so giving people that critical understanding is really has been the backbone of our organization for a long time, and this is an expression of that mission.
All right. Lovely stuff. Okay, now Jennifer, how did your background, which includes making the corporation documentaries, help you tell this tale?
Mhm. Sure. Yeah, so my name's Jennifer Abbott, I should say, just to start with. And I've been a filmmaker and a media activist and artist for almost 30 years now. So, and I should just say I'm the story editor on How to Buy a Country. I want to give full credit and authorship to, the team, and not take undue credit myself. But it was a really lovely project to story edit on. As people hopefully know, some people have seen both corporation films. The first one came out in 2003, and then we did a sequel in 2020, The New Corporation, the unfortunately necessary sequel. And both films look at very, very similar themes to How to Buy a Country. I mean, way back in the early 2000s, we were really reflecting upon the corporation as an institution at a time when anti-globalization movements were really just starting, and there wasn't a lot of awareness about it. And for people that haven't seen the corporation, really what we do is we say, well, the corporation is legally considered a person, and if that's the case, what kind of person is it? And we very rigorously, I think, anyway, go through a checklist from the DSM-4 and determine and diagnose the corporation as a psychopath. So, not particularly flattering, but so we really were one of the first films to really look at the institution of the corporation. And I think How to Buy a Country does very similar things. We look at there's similar themes of neoliberalism, of market fundamentalism, trickle down economics, criticizing all of those things, as our other film does, The New Corporation. And, I think we find ourselves at a time in history where these things are coming under attack finally in a more mainstream way. Like I've been criticizing them for for my whole adult life, as have so many others. But now that criticism is coming into the mainstream. And so I think with How to Buy a Country, it's so timely, especially I'm so appreciative of the way the team linked in the Americans, particularly DJT's threats to annex our country, which I think what that did in many ways is it shone this light on the fact that borders are not God-given, countries are not God. Nothing is natural, and rather all of these things are socially constructed. They're all contingent. They're all contestable, and we really can't take anything for granted now. And so, how do we want to go forward and hopefully build a future that is different than the one that we've built in the past? So,
Okay, well, thank you for your answer there. And would you recommend a couple or a few good books on trade in Canada, Jennifer?
well, it's interesting. I saw that question, and I'd like to pivot a little bit more broadly, not necessarily about trade and like political economics, I think. And I go back, one of my favorite is Carol Polanyi's The Great Transformation. And I see Gareth is nodding your head there. It actually came out in 1944. And it is so prescient and so predictive of this moment in time. It really looked at how markets are political constructions, and they're not natural, and that society, if it chooses to subordinate everything to the market, which is really in effect what we've done, that's going to have some very dire consequences, and there's going to be pushback. I think that we're finding ourselves in that particular moment now. And unfortunately, so much of people's disgruntlement with the system, their anger is, which is easier to harness, anger and hate, easier to harness, is being directed at the wrong target. And I think that part of how To Buy a Country's goal is to reroute that anger and that frustration to something healthier as we go forward. So that's one book. And then the other book is Nick Hanauer's The Pitchforks Are Coming. And he's a billionaire venture capitalist. And he's really warning that this huge economic disparity is not good for anyone. It's not even good for those at the top. And ultimately, the backlash is going to affect everyone. And so I would recommend that one as well.
All right, I'll have to read both of them. Thank you for that. Gareth, what did you want to accomplish and also avoid on the topic of Trump in the show?
Yeah, I think Trump does feature in the series as sort of, he makes a couple cameos, but we don't really reference him by name all that much. And there's, I think, contrary to the way that the conventional news media tends to fixate on him as a personality, which really feeds into his power and appeal in a way. I was much more interested in talking about Trump as being part of a system and emblematic of a system rather than being a particular individual. Because to me, Donald Trump is actually really just an exaggeration of certain aspects of the degeneration of the American national character. He reminds me of other dictators in history, including Hitler, actually, in the sense that he's really this kind of empty, vacuous person who just reflects whatever he sees in the crowd that he's trying to embody. And that's, in a way, that's sort of what fascism really always is. And so there's what I wanted to tell is actually a much broader story about how everything we're experiencing right now isn't actually about Trump. Trump is a symptom rather than a cause of the issues that we're facing that are not just unique to Canada, but are actually global in nature. And it is the nature of the rise and fall of American power as one of the world's as the world's largest and most powerful global empire in history that we're really trying to investigate here, and how can the sort of changes within that are internal to Canadian politics are actually deeply connected and interwoven with those larger global processes. And the deeper question is about really how the role of Trump what role Trump plays in both transforming, but also ultimately trying to or attempting to, but I think ultimately failing at maintaining America's economic hegemony over the world. And so that really does come up a lot in the final episode of the series, which talks a lot about the contestation between the United States and China, and what the Iran war has done to really cede ground to China in terms of this sort of battle over the geopolitics of the 21st century.
Okay, well, that was refreshing to hear. So, this is a question for Gareth and Jennifer. The show suggests a new path should be taken to avoid this particular situation that we Canadians find for the future. What could that look like?
You want to go first, Gareth, or do you want me to?
Sure,
Either way.
sure. I'll start and feel
Okay.
free to riff on it.
Okay. Okay.
I think that it's hard. This is often one of the things that like leftists really struggle with. Is like you read a book that's like 95% dense political economic critique, and then the last chapter is like, oh, but there's hope. And the hope is some vague thing like mutual aid or like third places or something. But I think for me, it actually, I thought about this a lot, and it is pretty, I do feel like it's quite concrete. One of the major things that really restructured Canada's economy back in the 1980s was this thing called the Royal Commission on the Economy that was chaired by a man named Donald MacDonald. So it was the MacDonald Commission. And not only did that recommend free trade, but it also recommended basically the importation of like Reagan, Thatcher style politics into Canada in terms of the adoption of austerity budgets and privatization, etc. It seems like anytime that Canada has a major crisis, they appoint a royal commission. So that's what I think we should do now. I think that there should be a royal commission appointed on the future of Canada's economy and place in the world. But I think that should be linked to a citizens' assembly, some kind of democratic citizens' assembly or group of people that are chosen at random by lottery across the country that can inform the findings and the work of this sort of expert commission. I personally have ideas as to the policies and things that could be included in the recommendations of such a commission that are very specific to me, and that also the film does push towards, which include things like a national energy transition fund that would actually invest in a national renewable energy grid as a nation building project that doesn't rely on foreign ownership and this sort of export oriented model of development. And that national fund could be funded by something like an excess profits tax on the like energy related inflation that's happening right now as a result of the Iran war, right? There's things that we can do to actually sequester the money that's necessary to invest in a new kind of society that would also create more jobs and lower energy bills and all kinds of things that could actually reorient the whole national project of Canada. But I think to me the broader question than in individual like infrastructure projects is how do we reinvest in our social democracy itself, and what are the collective decision making processes that are necessary to manifest that. So that's why I suggest something like a royal commission.
Okay, I guess I'll just add because that was quite specific. I'll be broader, and because really I'm more focused on the way stories and narrative, master narratives in our society take root and become naturalized, and then how that impacts the way that we organize society. It just seems to me, well, not only me, a lot of people that the stories that we've been telling ourselves. I mean, I and other lefties have found highly problematic for a very long time, but it seems like that sort of sentiment is infiltrating more into the mainstream, and that it really is there is this moment in time where there's a space to imagine other possibilities for what even the most fundamental questions like who are we as a species, what's our place on this planet, how do we coexist in a world where how we are living is actually causing a catastrophe with climate destabilization. So I think the moment is now where there's a lot of receptivity for new stories, and also most with regards to the economy, the economy is a tool. It's not a deity, and so we need to ask different questions about the economy. It's not, we have to look at limiting certain really destructive practices within late stage capitalism. And also ask questions about, how do we use the economy to enhance democracy, to live in a way with reciprocity with other humans and with the earth and other creatures? What are the ecological limits we need to respect? How do we live and promote compassion and justice? And, these things are all possible. And I do think there's, if we look at, for example, the primaries that just happened in New York, and who swept the primaries, all of the candidates, all of the people that were saying exactly this won. And so I think that just shows you that the time is now for this kind of change. And really, we need to create. Ultimately, I think we have to go to the root, like how do we conceive of ourselves as human beings, and also very importantly, I think also it's important as we look at Canadian sovereignty not to romanticize our history. We are a colonial settler state. Huge historical issues, still much reparation to be done there. Looking to Indigenous people for leadership is another very important way that we need to go forward. And so, I think it's an exciting time. We can look at this time, whatever it is. It's an exciting time to be alive, however it goes. Yeah.
Well, hopefully it all works out, or something positive finally happens. Maybe we could go 1 year without a new war. But thank you very much for both your answers there. That was great. So my next question is for Gareth. Mark Carney drew a line in the sand over America wanting to take over Canada and Greenland in his speech at the World Economic Forum, but thinks the war in Iran is worth it. So, how useful is he ultimately on the world stage, in your view?
Um, so I don't really have a very high opinion of Mark Carney. I think that's pretty obvious from anybody that watches the film. I think Mark Carney is like a classic Liberal Party politician that loves a word salad. So just, saying all of the various floating signifiers that make it sound like he has beliefs. But ultimately, I don't think that I mean, he has an ideological orientation. It's just called neoliberalism, which means that all he is ultimately trying to do, and the way that his words shift and sort of have these ambiguities embedded in them, is that he's trying to keep control of a system that is completely breaking apart. under his grip. And there's a lot of people like that in the world. Like Emmanuel Macron is another example of that. And the sort of these people don't have much of a future, frankly. And so the reality, like when Carney says something like, he makes his big lovely Davos speech, which I can list a litany of different Mark Carney speeches that everybody like going all the way back to 2015. He said climate change was he gave this big speech called The Tragedy of the Horizons about how climate change was the greatest threat to our civilization, and then now is like proceeding to embark on a complete and total deregulation of all like Canada's climate policy framework. And so he's a good talker and a good writer, but in terms of action, doesn't really follow it up. And this is, he when he says things like Canada needs to help make America great again, is just such a hilarious sentiment to me, because this was the guy who ran his whole thing about running against Trump in the election was that he was the guy to stand up to Trump. But so I think the thing is that the only thing that's useful in this situation is not Carney as an individual, but it's the context that we can create around him. He talks about wanting to be a middle power, for Canada to sort of, separate itself from being just a satellite of American empire, and take on more of a role around in the world. And I think there's an opportunity for civil society and social movements in this country to sort of push him into that space and craft and sort of create more clearly what that actually looks like in terms of moving towards new energy systems, new trading partners, and reinvesting in multilateralism now that the United States has decided to defect from that stage. But those are not things that are guaranteed. Like, we have to push him to do that. So I don't think he's completely useless, but I just don't think that he can be trusted on his own.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Jennifer, is Brian Mulroney the ultimate Canadian villain in this show?
I'm always quite skeptical of stories of villains and heroes. And so, I mean, I remember when with that election between Brian Mulroney and John Turner, obviously I was very much against the free trade agreement back then, and now, like trickle down economics and many other things, it's been shown to by many, not everyone, but both be very, very destructive. So I won't pin the blame on Brian Mulroney specifically, just as I won't, for example, um, like I just don't think that in like making individual people the villains is that useful. Rather, it's the structures. It's the protagonist is the worldview. What we want to critique is the structure. And so I would say the villain is more neoliberalism, most broadly.
Okay, noted. Gareth, I admit I feel like the Overton window does not favor left wing economic policies in the year 2026. So I feel like you don't agree, but why do you think that is the case, or not the case?
Yes, you're right that I don't agree. I don't think that Jennifer would agree either, but I don't want to speak for her. But I think to be totally honest, I think that these terms left versus right, I don't really think that they apply anymore. And I think it's a sort of example of how the political compass has really shifted and transformed in recent decades. But I think when you see the popularity of politicians like Zoran Mamdani or Zach Polanski in the UK, and also there's YouTube channels like More Perfect Union that are the fastest growing YouTube channel in the world. It's a channel that tells concise and digestible and compelling stories about political economy and corporate power. There's a reason that these stories are resonating with people and uniting across political difference. I often say to people, it's class war, not culture war, or this idea that it's not left versus right, it's top versus bottom. I also say that a lot. There's the super majority of people that are tired of what they feel is like a broken economic system. And so to me, there is actually tremendous opportunity for progressive movements to lean into that frustration and channel it, just as Jen was saying, to more productive alternatives. We're living at the moment in a contest, really. We live in populist times, and there's a very liberal sort of condescension towards the word populist. But the reality is that populist just means popular, like responding to the needs of the people, which our democracies have not been doing for a matter of decades. And so what this means is that we're living in a time where we're stuck in this contest over the definition of who is an elite group. And it's either the corporate elite and the owners of capital, which I think are the actual true elites, or it's whoever those people decide are the elites that can serve as convenient scapegoats for their rhetoric. And so that's usually the media and activists and university professors and everybody that they call woke, right? But the reality we have to understand is it is our job as communicators to define who the elites are, or it will get defined for us. And this is also why I think that the biggest threat right now in this moment is not actually the political right. It's actually the left of center liberal people whose sole diagnosis of our current political problem is that the left is too radical and needs to be more moderate and less woke or whatever. It's sort of like what Martin Luther King once said about the real danger being the white moderate during the civil rights movement. I think that these people are very dangerous, and Mark Carney is the king of those people.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And so my question is for both of you now: what makes you believe in humanity in 2026, or if you do?
I'll start with that. I mean, I've been making films for a long time now that deal with very, very difficult subject matter and that have taken me to places where catastrophe has, just been a part of how people have been, impacted how people are living there locally. And what always astounds me is just like going into these places in these communities. And it's so different than I'm going to compare that to, unfortunately, who really has many of the levers of power today, which are recently dubbed the Epstein class. And there's a syndrome called the hubris syndrome, which I think is really interesting. I think when you have that much power, your whole way of being in the world is so distorted, and sadly they have so much influence. But if we actually go to the communities where people have been struggling for a very long time, just the the beauty that you see there, the resilience, and the laughter and the love, and still the belief in what is best about humanity, it just shines. So I'm constantly inspired when I have the opportunity to interact with people on the front lines, really. And they also have a lot of meaning in their lives, which many lives are today so devoid of. Unfortunately, it's a very difficult thing to find meaning. I don't pin that on the people themselves, but rather the structures in our society that sort of created, it's a design flaw. It's so hard to have a meaningful life now. But I think that when you really get down to the basics, I do believe people are good. Ultimately, not all people, most people.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that it is definitely, I go back and forth on this because I want to believe in humanity, but then I also am so deeply struck by this sort of just like profligate nature of violence and destruction and cruelty and sadism that we see everywhere all the time. But I do think that it's a nature, it's the fact of the matter is that our media and also the algorithms are set up to divide and sort of alienate people and isolate them, and the reality is that there are lots of amazing, very inspiring things that are happening around the world that we just don't even know or hear about, right? There's whole models of the permaculture revolution and how society, whole regions of the world are building more resilient food systems. There's like participatory budgeting models that are revitalizing local democracies all across the world. There's a city in Brazil called Belo Horizonte that used participatory budgeting to pass a right to food that eliminated, literally, completely eliminated hunger in that city. And there's models that can show what it can look like to build a better world. We just don't hear about them, right? So it's also our job as storytellers not just to critique systems, but also to highlight alternatives. But I think there's Zoran just recently quoted Gramsci talking about we're living in the time of monsters, the old is dying, the new cannot be born. Or I think about the quote from William Butler Yeats where he says, the things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The best among us are lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I think we're living through one of those times right now. The end of an empire is never pretty, but I think the question is sort of what world outside of empire can we build, and that's sort of always been the question since the invention of empires 5,000 years ago.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Gareth and Jennifer. Do you both have a final message today about your show, How to Buy a Country?
Well, I'll let you have the final word, Gareth. So I'll just say, I think that one thing it really does so well is it shows that the world we inhabit, it's not natural or inevitable, but it's the product of decisions. It's the product of institutions, it's ideologies, stories. And that, what I hope it does is that it interrupts some dominant narratives, making the familiar strange. And once these stories become visible, they become contestable. And once they're contestable, you can imagine a different future. So that's my hope, and my congratulations to the team upon their release of this series. And I think it does all of these things that I've just stated very, very well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, that's very thoughtful. And I guess I would just say that it has been an ultimate sort of dream of mine to work on a project like this because I've wanted to tell this story in some ways for so long. And it really took a long time for it to cohere, and has changed and transformed a lot in the last. We've been working on it for the last 3 years. So I really hope that people like it and engage, but I would also recommend that people check out the website, which is howtobuycountry.ca, and you can go to a tab that says take action, and there's actual sort of activities and things that you can do and petitions and ways to get involved with different organizations. So in addition to having this be a piece of a storytelling, we also wanted to we come from a larger movement for climate and social justice, and we will remain deeply connected to that movement. And so I very much strongly suggest that people check that out and see how else they might be able to get involved. Thank you.
Oh, okay, lovely. Well, thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.